On the morning of October 14th, 2025, the routine of a quiet Tuesday in Lompoc, California, was interrupted by a procedural concern that would soon escalate into a nationwide investigation. A diligent administrator, tasked with monitoring the attendance and safety of the individuals, noted a prolonged and unexplained absence of a specific person. In the modern system, attendance records act as a primary safety net for individuals. When an individual vanishes from the roster without prior notice or guardian verification, it triggers a mandatory welfare check. This protocol is not merely administrative. It is the first line of defense in identifying potential domestic crises. The administrator contacted local law enforcement, reporting that the subject had not been seen for a significant period. This report was the catalyst for what Sheriff Bill Brown would later describe as a case involving calculated, cold-blooded, and criminally sophisticated premeditation. At this initial stage, however, the situation was categorized as a welfare check, a standard procedure where deputies visit a residence to visually confirm the safety of an individual. Deputies from the Santa Barbara County Sheriff's Office responded to the family residence located in the Lompoc area. Upon arrival, they made contact with the female resident, the primary subject. The interaction at the doorstep is often a critical moment in missing person cases. Investigators are trained to observe the demeanor of the guardian. Is there panic? Is there confusion? Or is there an unsettling calmness? According to the official timeline released by the authorities, the missing individual was not present at the residence when deputies arrived. When questioned regarding the whereabouts of the missing subject, the suspect provided no verifiable explanation. This is a significant red flag in investigative profiling. In the vast majority of cases where an individual is temporarily absent, a guardian can provide a concrete location, a relative's house, a medical appointment, or a specific errand. The inability or refusal to provide a verifiable location shifts the dynamic of the police encounter immediately. The absence of a reasonable explanation from the resident transformed the situation from a routine check into an urgent investigation. Law enforcement operates on a principle of verification. When the suspect Buzzard could not account for the missing individual, the presumption of safety was shattered. Sheriff Brown noted that from the moment this case was reported, detectives pursued every lead with determination, with urgency, and with compassion. It is important to understand the psychological pressure on law enforcement in these early hours. The first 48 hours is a well-known concept in criminal justice, emphasizing that the likelihood of a positive outcome decreases as time passes. However, in this instance, the timeline was already complicated by the prolonged absence noted by the institution. The investigators were not starting at hour 1. They were already playing catch-up against a clock that had been ticking for days, perhaps weeks. The initial interaction with the suspect Buzzard presented immediate obstacles. As the sheriff later detailed, detectives faced deliberate efforts to prevent them from finding the missing individual and uncovering the truth. In the context of a news analysis, this suggests that the suspect was not merely passive, but actively engaging in deception or omission. When a primary caregiver withholds cooperation, investigators must pivot to external evidence, digital footprints, surveillance, and forensic data to build the narrative that the suspect refuses to provide. The silence at the Mars Avenue home on that Tuesday morning was deafening, signaling to the deputies that a complex and potentially tragic series of events had already been set in motion. Silence was the weapon used in this tragedy, but your awareness gives a voice to those who can no longer speak. Please like and follow to help us bring these hidden truths to light. Stay with us, because the evidence found in this quiet home is about to unravel a journey of calculated deception that defies the connection between the two individuals. Following the unsettling welfare check, the investigation escalated rapidly. By October 15th, 2025, just one day after the initial report, detectives returned to the Buzzard residence on the 500 block of Mars Avenue. This time, they arrived with a search warrant, A search warrant in a missing person case is a comprehensive legal tool. It authorizes law enforcement to examine the premises for any evidence pertaining to the missing individual's whereabouts. This includes not just physical items, but biological traces, digital devices, and any signs of a struggle or a planned departure. The speed at which this warrant was obtained and executed underscores the severity of the concern held by the Santa Barbara County Sheriff's Office. While the official reports do not describe the interior decor, forensic searches of this nature are methodical and invasive. Teams of investigators would have moved room by room, documenting the state of the living quarters. They were looking for the mundane clothing, toothbrushes, packed bags that might indicate a voluntary trip. Conversely, they were searching for the sinister cleaning supplies used recently, missing rugs, or areas that had been sanitized more thoroughly than the rest of the house. During this frantic search for clues to locate the missing person, investigators uncovered a piece of evidence that fundamentally altered the trajectory of the case. Inside the residence, they recovered an expended cartridge case. To the layperson, a small brass casing on the floor or tucked away in a corner might seem insignificant. However, in the language of forensic science, an expended cartridge case is a loud statement. It signifies that a firearm was discharged at that location. The casing is ejected from the weapon only after a round has been fired. Finding such an item inside a domestic residence, specifically the home of a missing person, is a grave indicator. It suggests that a violent event involving a firearm may have occurred within those walls. This discovery moved the investigation from a search operation mission toward a forensic inquiry focused on a potential serious incident. The sheriff's office noted that this evidence was immediately secured for advanced analysis. Simultaneous to the physical search of the home, detectives were conducting a financial and digital autopsy of the suspect Buzzard's recent life. They discovered that, subsequent to the timeline of the disappearance, the suspect had rented a vehicle. This was a crucial development. A rental car offers mobility and anonymity, distancing the driver from their personal vehicle, which might be known to neighbors or law enforcement. Investigators obtained video surveillance images from the rental car office. The footage was chilling in its implications. It showed the two subjects standing at the counter, but with a disturbing detail. Both were wearing wigs. The sheriff described this behavior as an apparent attempt to conceal their identity. The use of disguises, specifically wigs, speaks to a high level of premeditation. It suggests that the primary resident was aware that her movements needed to be hidden. By disguising not only herself, but also the accompanying individual, she was actively managing the perception of onlookers and cameras. This criminal sophistication, as termed by Sheriff Brown, indicates that the events were not a result of a sudden, chaotic break, but rather a planned sequence of actions. The image of the two figures, disguised and renting a vehicle to leave town, provided investigators with a visual anchor for their timeline. It also raised a harrowing question. Was the second subject a willing participant in this game of disguise, unaware of the danger, or was she coerced? The combination of the expended cartridge case found at the home and the surveillance footage of the rental car transaction widened the scope of the inquiry instantly. It was no longer a local Lompoc case. The rental car meant travel, and the wigs meant evasion. On October 22nd, these surveillance images were released to the public in an effort to generate leads. The investigation was now a race against time, tracking a vehicle that had potentially crossed state lines. The discovery at Mars Avenue had provided the first piece of the puzzle, but it also confirmed the investigators' worst fears. Violence had likely occurred, and the suspect had taken elaborate steps to cover her tracks. The empty house on Mars Avenue was not just a missing person's last known location, it was a primary incident location. As the investigation at the Mars Avenue residence transitioned from a welfare check to a forensic inquiry, detectives began to reconstruct the financial movements of the primary subject. In modern investigations, credit card statements and bank withdrawals often serve as a digital roadmap, revealing intent before physical evidence is ever found. Investigators discovered that prior to the disappearance, A vehicle had been rented under the suspect's name. This detail was pivotal. It suggested that the primary vehicle associated with the family was left behind or avoided, a common tactic used when an individual wishes to separate their movements from their known routine. Acting on this financial lead, detectives secured surveillance footage from the rental car agency. The video, time-stamped days before the official report was filed, provided the first visual confirmation of the pair since they had vanished from the public eye. However, the footage revealed a disturbing detail that Sheriff Bill Brown would later highlight as evidence of criminal sophistication. In the grainy security video, both individuals were visible standing at the counter. Yet, they were not presenting their natural appearance. Both individuals were wearing wigs. To the casual observer, this might have appeared as a harmless eccentricity, but to seasoned investigators, it signaled a deliberate attempt to alter physical descriptions. By masking their hair color and style, two of the most common identifiers used in emergency alerts and missing person flyers, the primary resident had effectively compromised the public's ability to recognize them during the initial, critical hours. Legal analysts observing the case noted that the use of disguises speaks to a specific state of mind. It suggests that the departure was not a spur-of-the-moment decision driven by sudden panic or a mental health crisis, but rather a calculated event. The decision to procure wigs implies that there was a plan to move through public spaces undetected. From a criminological perspective, this behavior creates a narrative of consciousness of guilt. If the trip were merely a vacation or a family emergency, there would be no need for concealment. The wigs served as a physical barrier between the pair and the rest of the world, allowing them to move as strangers in their own community before disappearing onto the open road. This piece of evidence, released to the public on October 22nd, shifted the tone of the search from a rescue mission to a pursuit of a suspect who was actively evading capture. On October 24th, the Santa Barbara County Sheriff's Office released a comprehensive timeline that left the public and press stunned by the sheer scale of the journey. What had started as a disappearance in Lompoc, California, had evolved into a multi-state odyssey covering thousands of miles. The investigative team, utilizing a combination of license plate readers, financial transaction data, and cellular tower pings, reconstructed a route that resembled a frantic, yet determined, loop across the American West. The initial leg of the trip took the pair away from the coast, pushing eastward with relentless momentum. The verified travel route included passage through California, crossing the border into Nevada, and then traversing Arizona. The journey did not stop there. The vehicle continued northward into Utah, pushed further into the rugged terrain of Wyoming, and eventually reached the plains of Nebraska. This was not a direct route to a known destination. There were no known family connections in these remote areas that would justify such a trip. The erratic nature of the path suggested a driver who was either searching for something specific or running from something internal. The return journey was equally arduous. The timeline indicated a path winding back through Kansas and Colorado, re-entering Utah, and then moving down through Arizona and Nevada before finally returning to California. The vastness of this geographical footprint posed a nightmare for law enforcement. A crime scene could theoretically exist anywhere along this thousands of miles stretch. Experts in missing persons cases pointed out the logistical challenges of such a trip. Driving for days on end requires fuel, rest, and sustenance. Yet, the investigation revealed very little digital interaction during this time, suggesting a disciplined effort to remain off the grid. The choice of states is also significant. Wyoming, Utah, and Nevada contain some of the most desolate and unpopulated stretches of highway in the United States. By choosing this route, the driver minimized the chance of sustained interaction with other people. It was a journey designed for isolation. For the investigators, this map was not just a travelogue. It was a haystack of continental proportions, within which they had to find a single, critical needle. As detectives delved deeper into the logistics of the road trip, they uncovered evidence that the rental car itself had been manipulated to avoid detection. In a move that demonstrated significant forensic awareness, The suspect had removed the original license plates of the rental vehicle. In their place, she attached a license plate from the state of New York. This is a tactic known as plating, often used by individuals involved in trafficking or high-level transport of illicit goods to confuse law enforcement. If a police officer were to run the New York plate, it would not match the registration of the rental vehicle, potentially causing confusion or delaying a stop. However, in the age of automated readers, this also carries a risk. The fact that the suspect took this risk indicates a desperate need to dissociate the vehicle from the rental agreement and, by extension, her own identity. Further reviewing surveillance footage from gas stations and rest stops along the route, investigators noticed a consistent behavioral pattern. When pulling into service stations to refuel or buy supplies, the suspect would deliberately back the vehicle into parking spots. This was not a matter of parking preference. Most modern patrol cars and automated surveillance systems are equipped with automatic license plate recognition technology, which scans plates as they patrol through lots. By backing in, the suspect obscured the rear license plate, which is often the only plate required or visible in certain states from the view of passing scanners and fixed security cameras. Sheriff Bill Brown described these actions as criminally sophisticated. This terminology is crucial in the legal context. It counters any potential defense, arguing that the suspect was in a state of disorganized psychosis or confusion. A confused individual might drive aimlessly, but they rarely take systematic steps to defeat surveillance technology. The combination of the plate switch and the anti-surveillance parking tactics painted a portrait of a suspect who was hyper-aware of being hunted. Every stop was calculated. Every movement was designed to buy more time. This level of evasion suggested that the suspect knew exactly what law enforcement would be looking for and took specific, knowledgeable steps to blind them. For the public watching the case unfold, these details transformed the image of the primary resident from a distraught figure into a cold, tactical operator. In any high-profile disappearance, the investigation inevitably centers around the last proof of life. This is the definitive moment where law enforcement can scientifically verify the presence of the missing individual before they vanish from the grid. For the detectives tracking the movements of the suspect Buzzard and her younger subject, this critical juncture was identified as Thursday, October 9th, 2025. According to the updated timeline shared by the sheriff's office, surveillance cameras captured images of the pair on the Colorado side of the Colorado-Utah border. This specific geographical marker is significant. It places both individuals alive and together deep into their multi-state journey, days after they had left California. The footage from this location served as the final anchor for the investigative timeline, confirming that up until that Thursday, the younger subject was still traveling with her, the primary resident. The narrative of the road trip takes a dark turn immediately following this border crossing. While subsequent surveillance footage continued to track the vehicle and the driver as they moved through Utah and back toward the West Coast, the passenger was notably absent. Investigators noted that after the stop on the Colorado-Utah border, the missing individual was no longer visible in any video feeds associated with the vehicle or the primary resident. This sudden absence from the visual record led detectives to a grim hypothesis. Based on the cessation of sightings and the forensic data analyzed later, authorities concluded that the tragic incident likely occurred shortly after that specific stop on October 9th. From an analytical perspective, narrowing down the time of the incident to this specific window is crucial for the prosecution. It transforms a weeks-long road trip into a precise timeline of events. By pinpointing the location where the younger subject was last seen, investigators could focus their search efforts on the rugged terrain spanning the border regions. This development also speaks to the ruthlessness described by Sheriff Brown. If the theory holds true, that the primary resident continued to drive for days and potentially weeks after the event, maintaining the facade of a trip while traveling alone, The psychological ability to continue a routine, renting vehicles and navigating highways after such a catastrophic event, reinforces the profile of a suspect operating with a high degree of detachment and calculation. As the calendar turned to late October, the investigation entered a more aggressive phase of evidence collection. On October 30th, detectives, accompanied by the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Evidence Response Team, executed a series of follow-up search warrants. These warrants were not limited to the residence on Mars Avenue. They expanded to include a storage locker rented by the suspect Buzzard and the rental vehicle she had used during the trip. The involvement of the Evidence Response Team signals the high stakes of this search. These specialized units are deployed when microscopic and biological evidence is expected to play a decisive role in a case. The search of the storage locker was likely an attempt to find items that may have been removed from the home or the car, perhaps clothing, personal effects, or tools used to conceal the crime. The primary focus of this forensic sweep was the rental car. Vehicles are notoriously difficult crime scenes to sanitize completely. Biological traces often remain in fabric, crevices, and air filtration systems long after a visible cleanup has been attempted. During the meticulous examination of the vehicle, investigators uncovered a critical piece of physical evidence: a live round of ammunition. This discovery was not an isolated find. Detectives noted that this live round was of similar ammunition to the evidence found earlier at the residence. The significance of finding this specific type of ammunition in the car cannot be overstated. In the initial search of the home on Mars Avenue, investigators had recovered an expended cartridge case the shell left behind after a weapon is fired. Now, finding a live round of the same caliber and make in the vehicle created a forensic bridge between the two locations. Legal experts observing the case emphasize the importance of this link. It suggests that the same mechanism, the firearm associated with that specific ammunition, traveled with the suspect from the home to the vehicle. This continuity of evidence undermines any defense, suggesting that the events at the home were unrelated to the road trip. By submitting the expended cartridge case from the home to the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives for analysis in the National Integrated Ballistic Information Network, detectives were laying the groundwork for a scientific match that would later prove pivotal. The car was no longer just a mode of transport. It was a mobile container of evidence that directly connected the suspect to the potential weapon and the initial scene at the residence. Following the intensive searches of the residence on Mars Avenue and the rental vehicle, investigators found themselves in possession of a small but potentially game-changing piece of evidence: the single expended cartridge case recovered from the home. In the realm of modern criminal investigation, physical evidence often tells a story that suspects refuse to articulate. The discovery of this casing shifted the focus of the inquiry from a physical manhunt to a high-tech forensic analysis. Detectives made the strategic decision to submit this expended cartridge case to the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. The objective was to utilize a sophisticated federal tool known as the National Integrated Ballistic Information Network, or NIBIN. This decision marked a critical pivot point in the case, moving the investigation from local police work to a federal level of scrutiny. To understand the gravity of this step, one must appreciate the technology behind NIBIN. Legal analysts and forensic experts often describe this system as the fingerprint database for firearms. When a weapon is discharged, the internal mechanisms, specifically the firing pin and the ejector, leave microscopic scratches and indentations on the metal casing of the ammunition. These markings are unique to that specific mechanism, much like the ridges on a human fingertip are unique to an individual. By entering the high-resolution images of the markings found on the casing from the Mars Avenue residence into the national database, investigators were essentially casting a digital net across the entire country. They were not just looking for a match within Santa Barbara County. They were asking the system if this specific weapon had been used, or if its ammunition had been found in any other jurisdiction in the United States. The decision to utilize NIBIN was particularly vital, given the established mobility of the suspect. As the timeline had already revealed, the suspect Buzzard had traveled through California, Nevada, Arizona, Utah, Wyoming, and Nebraska. A firearm discharged in California could easily be transported and discharged again in a remote canyon in Utah or a roadside stop in Nebraska. Without a national database like NIBAN, connecting a casing found in a coastal town to a potential crime scene in the Rocky Mountains would be nearly impossible. It would rely on sheer coincidence or a confession. However, with this technology, the silence of the distance is bridged by data. The system allows disparate law enforcement agencies, who may be thousands of miles apart, to realize they are investigating the same weapon and, by extension, the same suspect. Commentators following the case noted that this phase of the investigation requires immense patience. The submission of evidence to the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives is not instantaneous. It involves a meticulous process of scanning, coding, and correlation. For the detectives on the ground, the expended cartridge case represented a silent witness. It was the only tangible proof that a weapon had been discharged, and it held the potential to link the domestic scene to wherever the journey had ended. While the search teams continued to scour physical locations, the forensic scientists were looking for a digital match that would confirm the investigators' darkest theories. Statistically, the submission to NIBAN is a gamble that often pays off in complex cases. In many investigations involving mobile suspects, the weapon is the common denominator across multiple scenes. By logging the evidence into the national network, the Santa Barbara authorities were effectively placing a digital marker in the system, waiting for another agency, perhaps states away, to find a matching piece of the puzzle. This step underscores the relentless nature of the pursuit mentioned by Sheriff Brown. It was an admission that traditional tracking methods might have reached their limit, and that the resolution of the case would rely on the cold, hard certainty of ballistic science. The cartridge case sat in the evidence locker, a small brass object that held the key to unlocking the truth of what happened during that long, unexplained silence on the road. On December 6th, 2025, the investigation shifted focus from the digital timeline to a tangible location in the American West. The setting was Wayne County, Utah, an area defined by its vast, rugged terrain and isolation. Authorities identified the specific area of interest as being outside of Caneville, a rural community that sits remotely along the highway. The specific coordinates led law enforcement to the 3,300 block of East State Route 24. This is not a densely populated urban center, but a stretch of road flanked by the natural elements of the canyon lands. The isolation of this area is a critical factor in the investigation, suggesting that the location was chosen specifically for its distance from prying eyes and the low likelihood of casual foot traffic. The breakthrough in the case did not come from a calculated police search grid, but rather through the inadvertent actions of civilians. A man and a woman were present in the area, engaged in taking photographs of the landscape. This detail underscores the role of chance in criminal investigations. Despite the criminally sophisticated efforts to conceal the crime, as described by the sheriff, the vastness of the desert could not hide the truth forever. While exploring the area adjacent to West Caneville Road, the couple stumbled upon a scene that immediately warranted law enforcement intervention. They made a grim discovery. The discovery was located off the side of the road, hidden enough to escape the notice of passing vehicles, but visible to those walking the ground. The witnesses immediately contacted the Wayne County Sheriff's Office. Deputies responded to the scene to secure the area and verify the report. Upon arrival, they confirmed the presence of the missing subject. Due to the passage of time and the exposure to the elements in such a remote environment, the identification was not immediately possible through visual means alone. The condition of the remains was consistent with a timeline of weeks or months, aligning with the period the younger subject had been missing. Authorities noted that the significant changes due to environmental exposure had obscured immediate recognition. However, initial forensic observations at the scene determined that the decedent was female. Although the identity was not yet scientifically confirmed, the nature of the tragedy was evident to the responding officers. The preliminary assessment indicated that the individual had suffered a fatal injury. Specifically, authorities observed trauma consistent with ballistic injuries. This finding was pivotal. It transformed the discovery from a suspicious incident into a potential criminal inquiry. The Wayne County Sheriff's Office recognized the gravity of the find and the potential connection to ongoing missing persons cases in the region. On December 8, 2025, 2 days after the discovery, the Wayne County Sheriff's Office reached out to the Santa Barbara County Sheriff's Office. This interagency communication is the lifeline of modern policing. They informed the California detectives of the unidentified female found in their jurisdiction. Legal analysts point to this moment as the convergence of two separate investigative tracks. In California, detectives had the ballistics evidence, the expended cartridge case, and the missing persons report. In Utah, authorities had the physical discovery of a victim with injuries matching a firearm discharge. The notification bridged the gap between the missing status and the found reality. While the families in California were still holding on to the hope of a safe return, the discovery in the Utah Canyon began to close that window. The narrative had shifted from a search for a living person to a forensic effort to identify the silent victim found miles from home. The location, the gender, and the cause of death provided a grim, preliminary match to the profile of the missing individual, Melodee Buzzard, setting the stage for the scientific confirmation that would follow. Following the discovery of the remains by the photographers on December 6, 2025, the remote canyon in Wayne County, Utah, was transformed from a quiet natural landscape into a high-security investigative zone. The recovery of human remains in such a rugged, outdoor environment is a task that requires extreme precision and patience. Unlike an indoor setting where variables can be controlled, the open desert presents a chaotic mix of wind, terrain, and biological factors that can compromise evidence. The Wayne County Sheriff's Office, understanding the potential gravity of the find, treated the area with the highest level of procedural caution. The first step was not immediate removal, but rather the establishment of a secure perimeter to prevent any contamination. In forensic investigations of this magnitude, the position of the individual, the state of the clothing, and the relationship of the remains to the surrounding environment can tell a story as important as the biological evidence itself. Once the scene was secured, the medical examiner's office began the difficult work of initial assessment. The condition of the remains presented a significant challenge for immediate identification. Due to the prolonged exposure to the harsh elements of the Utah winter and the passage of time since the suspected timeline of the disappearance, the individual had undergone significant biological changes. In official reports, this state is often referred to legally as advanced biological breakdown rather than using more graphic descriptors. This natural process meant that facial recognition or standard visual identification by law enforcement was impossible. The person found in the canyon was, for the moment, a Jane Doe, an unidentified individual whose story was locked behind the barriers of forensic science. Despite the challenges of identification, the medical examination at the scene yielded critical, albeit grim, to the initial. Forensic review confirmed that the decedent was female. This immediately narrowed the scope of the potential investigation, allowing authorities to cross-reference the finding against missing female reports in the region and beyond. More disturbingly, the examination revealed the likely cause of the loss of life. Authorities observed trauma to the cranial area that was consistent with a ballistic injury. Specifically, the official statements indicated that the individual had suffered a fatal outcome involving a weapon. This finding was crucial. It ruled out natural causes, accidental exposure to the elements, or a fall from the canyon walls. It confirmed that this was a crime scene, and that the individual had been the victim of a violent act before being left in the remote location. On December 8, 2025, the investigation took a decisive turn toward resolution. Armed with the preliminary findings of gender and the specific nature of the trauma, the Wayne County Sheriff's Office reached out to the Santa Barbara County Sheriff's Office. This communication is a standard but vital part of the Violent Crime Apprehension Program protocols, where agencies share data on unidentified remains to solve cold cases or ongoing searches. The details provided by the Utah authorities: a female found in a remote area, deceased for a period consistent with the October timeline, and bearing injuries from a firearm, aligned terrifyingly well with the profile of the missing individual Melodee Buzzard case. For legal analysts and criminologists observing the case, this phase represents one of the most agonizing periods in a criminal inquiry. While the detectives strongly suspected a match, the legal standard requires absolute certainty before a confirmation can be made. This gap between discovery and identification is a procedural necessity. The coordination between the agencies was described as superb by Sheriff Brown, emphasizing that without this level of interstate cooperation, the remains might have stayed unidentified for years. The discovery in Utah validated the theory that the road trip was not just an evasion, but a disposal mission. It is important to acknowledge the human element of this procedural step. The recovery teams, the deputies, and the medical staff are tasked with handling the final moments of a stranger's physical presence with dignity. The term silent witness is often used in these contexts because, although the individual cannot speak, the forensic evidence they leave behind, the location, the injury, the timeline provides the testimony needed to bring a perpetrator to justice. For the investigators in California, the news from Utah on December 8th was the piece of the puzzle they had been dreading but expecting. It shifted the operational footing from a rescue mindset to a recovery and prosecution mindset. The focus now moved from finding the younger subject to proving, legally and scientifically, that the person in the canyon was indeed the missing individual, and that the ballistic evidence found in her, the primary residence home, was the key to her silence. On December 17th, 2025, the investigation into the disappearance of the missing individual Melodee Buzzard received its most significant forensic confirmation to date. After weeks of meticulous data entry and waiting, the Santa Barbara County Sheriff's Office received a formal notification from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. This was not a standard status update. It was the confirmation that investigators had been hoping for since the initial search of the suspect's home in October. The Bureau reported a successful hit within the National Integrated Ballistic Information Network. In the world of criminal justice, a hit represents a verified scientific match between two pieces of evidence that were previously unconnected in the system. This notification marked the transition of the case from a circumstantial investigation relies on travel logs and behavior to a case anchored in hard, irrefutable physical science. To understand the weight of this development, it is essential to analyze what the laboratory technicians achieved. During the initial search of the Buzzard residence on Mars Avenue, detectives had recovered a single expended cartridge case. This small piece of metal, ejected from a firearm during a discharge, was logged, and its unique markings were uploaded into the national database. Simultaneously, following the discovery of the remains in the remote canyon of Wayne County, Utah, investigators at that scene recovered multiple cartridge cases near the location of the recovery. These casings from the Utah desert were also processed and submitted to the same federal network. The computer algorithms, verified by human ballistic experts, determined that the markings on the casing found in the California bedroom were identical to the markings on the casings found next to the victim in Utah. This meant that the exact same mechanism, the same firearm, was used to discharge ammunition in both locations. Legal analysts following the case emphasize that this evidence is often referred to as the binding tie in a criminal case prosecution. The distance between Lompoc, California, and Caneville, Utah, is vast, covering hundreds of miles of highway and distinct legal jurisdictions. Without this ballistic link, a defense team could theoretically argue that the tragedy in Utah was a random act of violence committed by a stranger, unrelated to the primary resident's presence in the area. However, the Nibin hit dismantled that possibility. By scientifically proving that the weapon discharged in the primary resident's home was the same weapon discharged at the site where the younger subject was found, the evidence placed the means of the tragedy directly in the hands of the traveler. It created an invisible but unbreakable line, connecting the domestic residence to the remote crime scene. It is important to note a critical detail that emerged during the press briefing. Law enforcement had not yet recovered the actual firearm used in the offense. In many cases, the absence of the weapon involved is a significant hurdle. However, the ballistic match mitigates this absence. The casings serve as a proxy for the gun itself. They prove the weapon's presence at both critical points in the timeline. The fact that the firearm was discharged in the home, evidenced by the casing, and then carried across state lines to the location of the discovery, evidenced by the matching casings, demonstrates possession and transport. This aligns perfectly with the timeline of the rental car and the surveillance footage, reinforcing the theory of a calculated mobile plan rather than a stationary or impulsive event. Forensic experts often explain that firearm tool marks are as unique as a fingerprint. When a firing pin strikes a primer, or when an ejector grabs a casing to throw it out of the chamber, it leaves microscopic scratches and indentations that are specific to that machine's manufacturing and wear. The confirmation from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives means that the probability of another weapon making those exact marks is statistically negligible. For the investigators, this was the smoking gun, even without the gun itself. It provided the objective, scientific certainty needed to move forward with capital charges. While the report is technical, its emotional resonance is profound. For the family members waiting for answers, this match was the final confirmation that the violence suspected at the home had followed the younger subject to the canyon. It removed the ambiguity of what if. The science confirmed that the danger did not come from a stranger in the desert, but from the environment the victim had left behind in California. This development on December 17th set the stage for the final legal maneuvers, with the identity of the victim all but confirmed by circumstances, and now the weapon linked by science. The authorities had built a foundation robust enough to support the gravest of accusations. First degree, the incident. The investigation had successfully used advanced technology to speak for a victim who could no longer speak for herself. On December 22nd, 2025, the investigation reached its somber and definitive conclusion regarding the identity of the remains found in Utah. The Santa Barbara County Sheriff's Office received a critical notification from the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Crime Laboratory. This communication was the culmination of weeks of high-priority forensic work, utilizing the most advanced biological identification techniques available to law enforcement. Throughout the investigation, authorities had operated under a strong working theory that the individual discovered in the remote canyon was the missing younger subject. However, in the eyes of the law, a theory, no matter how well supported by circumstantial evidence, is not proof. The arrival of the laboratory report transformed that theory into an irrefutable legal fact. The FBI confirmed that the biological analysis was complete and the results were conclusive. The identification was achieved through a process known as familial DNA analysis. In cases where an individual has been exposed to harsh environmental elements for an extended period, obtaining a direct DNA profile can be challenging. However, forensic scientists can extract genetic material from the remains and compare it against reference samples provided by close biological relatives. In this instance, the laboratory compared the genetic profile of the remains found in Wayne County against the known DNA profile of the primary subject. The analysis determined that the remains were a familial DNA match to the suspect. This scientific link provided the absolute certainty required to issue a formal identification. It ruled out any possibility of mistaken identity and closed the door on the faintest hopes that the discovery might have been unrelated to the Lompoc case. With the science secured, the medical examiner and the sheriff's office formally identified the decedent as the missing individual Melodee Buzzard. The confirmation brought a devastating finality to the timeline that began on October 14th. For the investigators, this was the moment the missing person file was officially closed and the criminal case file was fully opened. Sheriff Bill Brown later acknowledged the gravity of this moment during his public address, noting that while the development was an important step toward accountability, it did not diminish the profound loss experienced by the community. The scientific identification serves as the cornerstone of the prosecution's case, ensuring that when the matter goes to trial, there will be no ambiguity regarding who was found in the desert. Following the receipt of the FBI report, the most difficult duty of the investigation was performed: the notification of the next of kin. Authorities reached out to the extended family members, specifically the Mesa and Buzzard families, to inform them that the search had ended. This process is handled with extreme care and protocol. The families, who had endured what the sheriff described as unimaginable pain and steadfast hope since the disappearance, were now forced to confront the reality of the tragedy. The notification is not just a transfer of information. It is the shattering of the suspended state of uncertainty that families of missing persons live in. The authorities emphasized that the family's strength and patience had been evident throughout the ordeal, acknowledging that no family should ever have to experience such a loss. From a legal perspective, the DNA confirmation acts as the final lock on the case's evidentiary chain. By proving the identity of the victim, the prosecution can now seamlessly link the other elements of the investigation: the timeline of the road trip, the surveillance footage of the primary resident and younger subject together, the ballistics from the home, and the location of the body into a single, cohesive narrative. Legal experts note that in a courtroom, DNA evidence is often the most powerful tool available. It is objective and mathematical. It strips away the defense's ability to argue that the victim is still missing or that the remains belong to a stranger. The confirmation on December 22nd ensured that the upcoming arrest of the suspect would be based not just on suspicion, but on biological certainty. The investigation had done its job. It had found the truth in the silence of the canyon, and now it was time to move toward justice. On the morning of December 23rd, 2025, the quiet routine of the Lompoc community was interrupted by the definitive conclusion of a 2-month investigation. At approximately 7:51 a.m., a joint task force comprised of members from the Santa Barbara County Sheriff's Office and the Federal Bureau of Investigation converged on the residence at the 500 block of Mars Avenue. This operation was not a routine inquiry. It was the execution of a calculated tactical plan. Authorities arrived armed with both search and arrest warrants, signaling that the investigative phase had transitioned into the prosecutorial phase. The timing of the operation, early in the morning, is a standard law enforcement tactic designed to ensure the presence of the suspect and to minimize the risk to the surrounding neighborhood and the officers involved. The primary objective of the raid was the apprehension of the primary subject, according to the official statement provided by Sheriff Bill Brown. The suspect was taken into custody without incident. This phrase, while standard in police reports, carries significant weight in a case of this magnitude. It indicates that despite the severity of the allegations and the sophisticated evasion tactics previously employed during the cross-country trip, the final moment of confrontation occurred without resistance or violence. The suspect was immediately transported from the residence to the Northern Branch Jail for processing. This transfer marked the physical removal of the individual from society and her entry into the criminal justice system. The specific facility, the Northern Branch Jail, would serve as her holding location as she awaited the initial judicial proceedings. Upon booking, the primary subject was formally charged with the most serious offenses regarding the fatal incident involving the younger individual. The classification of first degree is legally critical. It implies that the prosecution believes the evidence supports the theory of planned actions and deliberation elements that Sheriff Brown had previously highlighted when describing the crime as calculated and cold-blooded. Furthermore, the suspect was held without bail. In the American legal system, The denial of bail is reserved for capital cases or situations where the defendant poses a significant flight risk or a danger to the community. Given the suspect's demonstrated ability to travel across multiple state lines, use disguises, and alter vehicle identification, the decision to remand her without bail underscores the court's recognition of her potential to evade justice again. During the press conference following the arrest, questions were raised regarding the suspect's behavior. When asked if the suspect had confessed or shown any change in attitude, the sheriff provided a stark assessment. He confirmed that there had been no change in her attitude and her demeanor, and that she remained uncooperative. This lack of cooperation is a defining feature of the case. From the initial welfare check on October 14th, where she provided no verifiable explanation for her younger subject's whereabouts, to the moment of her arrest in December, the suspect maintained a wall of silence. Criminologists and legal analysts often view this sustained uncooperativeness not just as a legal strategy, but as a reflection of the ruthlessness the sheriff described. It suggests a suspect who is fully aware of the legal jeopardy she faces and is determined to provide no assistance to the authorities seeking closure. While the arrest represents a significant victory for law enforcement, it is bolstered by the overwhelming physical evidence gathered over the preceding weeks. The arrest was not based on a confession, as the suspect offered none, but on the significant amount of evidence recovered. The convergence of the ballistic match from the National Integrated Ballistic Information Network, the familial DNA confirmation from the FBI, and the surveillance footage of the disguised travel created a prosecutorial net that the suspect could no longer evade. The arrest on Mars Avenue was the final physical step in a process that had been driven by forensic science. The news of the arrest brought a complex mix of relief and sorrow to the community. Sheriff Brown addressed this duality, noting that while holding the suspect accountable is essential, it does not erase the profound loss of the younger subject. The arrest brings the investigation to a close, but it opens the door to a long and likely difficult legal battle. As the suspect sits in the Northern Branch jail, the narrative shifts from the detectives in the field to the prosecutors in the courtroom. The presumption of innocence remains a legal right, but the public release of the timeline and the forensic links presents a formidable challenge for any defense. The arrest of the primary resident, the very person trusted to protect the victim, stands as a grim testament to the sheriff's observation that this case involves a betrayal of the most fundamental human bond. In the aftermath of the arrest, the dialogue surrounding the case shifted from the how and where to the baffling question of what. During the press briefing, Sheriff Bill Brown utilized a specific clinical term to categorize the tragedy: familial fatal incident. This terminology is used to describe the specific act of a guardian causing the loss of a dependent. While the term provides a classification, it does little to assuage the public's confusion. The sheriff openly acknowledged this disconnect, stating that such an event is rare and always difficult to comprehend. In the broader landscape of violent crime, offenses committed within the immediate household, specifically those involving associated individuals within the same residence, are statistical anomalies. They contradict the fundamental biological and sociological imperatives of protection and caregiving, making them particularly jarring for the community to process. What distinguishes this specific case from other instances of domestic tragedy is the level of deliberation involved. Often, cases categorized as familial fatal incidents are associated with sudden mental health crises, immediate breakdowns, or moments of overwhelming, impulsive emotion. However, the investigation into the primary subject painted a starkly different picture. Sheriff Brown emphasized that this level of criminal activity was particularly shocking given the calculated, cold-blooded, and criminally sophisticated premeditation. The evidence of wearing wigs, renting vehicles under specific conditions, and mapping a route across multiple states suggests a mind that was not fractured by chaos, but rather focused on execution and evasion. Legal analysts suggest that this ruthlessness and heartlessness in planning removes the potential for a defense based on a sudden snap of judgment. The suspect did not just react, she prepared. The most haunting aspect of this case, as highlighted by the authorities, is the inversion of the relationship between the two subjects. In his statement, the sheriff noted that the evidence clearly indicated the crime was committed by the very person upon whom the victim relied upon and trusted the most in this world. This commentary strikes at the core of the societal contract. A dependent relies on a guardian for safety, sustenance, and guidance. When that figure becomes the source of harm, it creates a cognitive dissonance that is difficult to resolve. The investigation revealed that the victim accompanied the suspect on a cross-country journey, likely under the impression of a family trip. This exploitation of trust, using the victim's natural reliance to facilitate the crime, adds a layer of moral gravity that goes beyond the legal statutes. Despite the overwhelming physical evidence, the ballistics, the DNA, and the surveillance, one critical piece of the puzzle remains missing: the motive. When pressed by the media regarding the reason behind such a permanent and tragic decision, Sheriff Brown was transparent about the limitations of the current investigation. He stated, "We have not established a motive at this point." This admission is significant. In the court of public opinion, there is a desperate need for a why. Was it financial pressure? Was it a custodial dispute? Was it a psychological delusion? The absence of a clear motive leaves a void that invites speculation. However, from a prosecutorial standpoint, establishing a motive is not strictly necessary to secure a conviction for first-degree the fatal act. The state must prove that the act was intentional and premeditated, which the timeline and the disguises strongly support. The why may never be fully articulated by the suspect, who has remained uncooperative throughout the process. Behavioral experts often note that in cases of familial fatal incidents, the perpetrator may view the act through a distorted lens of saving the victim or removing them from a perceived negative environment. However, the sheriff's description of the criminally sophisticated evasion tactics contradicts the profile of a deluded savior. Instead, the behavior backing into parking spots to hide plates, switching license tags, and using cash aligns more closely with a fugitive fleeing the consequences of a known wrongful act. The community is left to grapple with the reality that some actions may lack a rational explanation. The unimaginable pain endured by the extended family is exacerbated by this silence. As the case moves toward trial, the focus will likely remain on the cold mechanics of the trip and the weapon, because the why appears to be locked away in the mind of a suspect who refuses to speak. As the immediate shock of the arrest began to settle, the focus of the public and the press turned toward the sheer magnitude of the law enforcement effort required to bring this case to a resolution. During the final press briefing, officials took great care to outline the extraordinary level of coordination involved. Sheriff Bill Brown and Lieutenant Chris Gottschall emphasized that this was not the work of a single department, but a coalition of justice spanning half the continent. The investigation required the synchronization of the Santa Barbara County Sheriff's Office with federal heavyweights, specifically the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. Furthermore, the gratitude extended to the Wayne County Sheriff's Office in Utah highlighted the critical role that local agencies play in resolving national cases. The list of allied agencies, ranging from the California Department of Justice to the Colorado Bureau of Investigation and the Nebraska State Police, illustrates the complexity of tracking a suspect across state lines. Legal analysts noted that this level of superb coordination is often the deciding factor in modern criminal cases, where mobility is used as a weapon to evade capture. One of the most pressing legal questions following the discovery of the remains in Utah was where the trial would take place. Typically, a criminal case is tried in the jurisdiction where the loss of life occurred. However, Sheriff Brown clarified that the judicial proceedings would be held in Santa Barbara County. The legal reasoning behind this decision centers on the concept of intent. Investigators and prosecutors believe that the intent to commit the crime was formed within Santa Barbara County prior to the suspect departing on the road trip. This legal distinction allows the local district attorney to retain jurisdiction over the case. It serves as a strategic prosecutorial move, anchoring the trial in the community where the younger subject lived and where the initial evidence, the ballistics, and the rental records originated. This ensures that the justice process remains local to those who knew the missing individual best. With the suspect held without bail at the Northern Branch Jail, the case now enters the rigorous phase of the judicial process. Authorities were careful to remind the public that despite the arrest and the charges of first-degree the incident, the suspect is entitled to the presumption of innocence until proven guilty in a court of law. This disclaimer is a cornerstone of the legal system, ensuring that the upcoming trial is conducted with integrity and fairness. Sheriff Brown stated that the investigation does not end here. Detectives will continue to work closely with prosecutors to solidify every piece of evidence, from the DNA analysis to the surveillance timelines. The goal is to ensure that the judicial process moves forward without error, preventing any technicalities from undermining the severity of the charges. In the concluding moments of the investigation's public phase, the tone shifted from procedural to personal. The sheriff spoke directly to the profound loss experienced by the community and the extended family. He offered deep condolences to the Mesa and Buzzard families, acknowledging the unimaginable pain they endured while waiting for answers. The sheriff's final words provided a somber reflection on the tragedy. He stated, "The individual deserved a different outcome." This sentiment resonates as the defining message of the case. The investigation was not just about solving a puzzle or testing forensic capabilities. It was about honoring the memory of a life that was cut short. The case of the West Coast traveler stands as a grim reminder of the vulnerabilities within the home. However, it also stands as a testament to the relentless determination of law enforcement. When obstacles were placed in their path, the detectives overcame them. When cooperation was withheld, they relied on the science. As the files are organized for trial and the media presence fades from Mars Avenue, the community is left with the resolve to remember the younger subject not as a case number, but as an innocent soul. The road to justice is long, but the path has been clearly marked by the dedicated work of those who refuse to let the silence of the canyon be the final word. The investigation has concluded, but the story of seeking accountability has only just begun.